Okay, so we've gone all the way from the tippy top of the brain, the cortex, through the subcortical structures, the brainstem, cerebellum. Last stop is the spinal cord before we get into the vasculature and the veins and the ventricles and whatnot. So we have the spinal cord, which moves down through the vertebral foramen, and it's going to shoot off little nerve roots through the intervertebral foramen, where they're going to have these large discs, which are going to cushion on the either side of a vertebral body. And also just note that there are seven cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae, and then 5 sacral vertebrae. And it's all matched with nerve roots. So we're going to see 12, 5, 5, except for the cervical, where there are 8 cervical nerve roots. That is going to be really important when we're trying to see whether a nerve root goes above or below a particular level. And that's going to be important for herniations. If we're looking, let's say that we have our little disc here, so between C1 and C2, always above the disc, it's going to be the nerve root above. So here's the C1, C2, the nerve root is moving above the C1, and then the C2 nerve root is moving above the C2 vertebrae, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, except that for the fact that, again, that we have this mismatch, now the 8th nerve root has to go below. And if that goes below, then that means that everything after that is also going to go below. So if we're looking at like the T1 vertebra, the T1 nerve root is going to be below. And if the L1 vertebra, it's the L1 nerve root is going to go below. So if that didn't make sense, just memorize that the cervical nerve roots will always exit above their corresponding vertebrae and discs. And then for the thoracic and lumbar, it's going to be below. So actually, let's skip here. I think I moved this out of order. So the point of that then is that if I had a herniation between C6 and C7, so the nerve root here is going to project laterally and just right next to the disc. So if I have a herniation, remember this is the C7 vertebra, the nerve root that it corresponds with it exits above. So this is the C7 nerve root. I don't know what size, C6, C7 nerve root. That is going to, this herniation between C6 and C7 is going to affect the C7. So C6 and C7 herniation, we see that it affects the 7. Now, what about here? Here I'm going to have the L4, L5 disc. And now, again, once we go to the thoracic and lumbar, the nerve roots exit below. So here's the L4 vertebra. So the L4 nerve root goes below, and here's the L5, and the L5 is going to go below. But another thing happens to kind of offset this, because, right, we might now conclude that it's the L4 nerve root that's being affected. But because of the way the cauda equina works, and the nerve roots kind of, I don't know the right metaphor. They're procrastinating and they have to play catch up, but they start to descend actually quite inferior before moving laterally, right? Here it's just kind of moving right laterally, but here they move really inferior before moving laterally. So if we have a herniation, it's actually not going to hit the L4 nerve root. It's actually going to hit the L5 nerve root. So again, if we look L4, L5, it's actually going to go 5. So if that was all gobbledygook, what you should know is that whenever you're looking at a particular disc herniation, it is always going to be with a more inferior associated vertebral body or vertebral root, or nerve root, however you want to think of that. So the L5, between the L4 and the L5, and then between the C6 and the C7, it's going to be the C7. So dermatomes and myotomes, all of these nerve roots that are exiting are innervating different parts of the body. Dermatome is talking about the sensory aspect, and the myotome is talking about the motor aspect. For the most part, though, these kind of line up. And you guys don't have to be experts, but you should have like a decent rule of thumb. So let's start with C5 at the shoulder, and then we're going to move down more or less C6, C7, C8, and then all the way up here T1. I don't know why there's another T1 there. So T1 up here, and then T10 at the belly button, T10. And here we're looking at L1 kind of at the trouser and the medial side. And as it moves down the leg, L2, L3, L4, and L5, it's going to kind of move medial to lateral as well, is what these arrows are trying to show. This is also on the anterior for the lumbar. The sacral is actually going to pick up more on the posterior aspect. And it's going to move up until it then it's going to supply the bathing suit region, the genitals, and the perianal region and whatnot. So a couple landmarks: C5 to C8 for the arms, T1 to T10 for the thorax, L1 to L5 for the anterior leg, and then S for the posterior leg and the genitals. Now a couple of reflexes you should know: C6 with the triceps, biceps, C7. Cremaster reflex right here, L1. Kind of makes sense. That's sort of where they're being stroked. I don't know the right word. Patellar, I think L1 to L5, what's in the middle? The middle is L3. What about what's in the middle of your leg on the anterior side? It's your knee. So that's why this is the patellar reflex. Achilles, right when we go into the back side. So again, we've been kind of going like medial to lateral on the anterior, and then we go pick up on the posterior. So the very first thing then would be the S1. They say S2, S3, S4 keeps the penis off the floor. And then also winks galore. So knowing the associations there is good. Also point and shoot. So point and shoot. Parasympathetic and sympathetic. The erection point is parasympathetic innervation. Sympathetic shoot is going to be, well, just there, the sympathetic innervation. All right, so sensory neurons are going to move up. Motor neurons are going to move down. The sensory neurons, though they're going to enter the spinal cord on the dorsal side, the motor neurons are going to exit the spinal cord on the ventral side. The associated soma, the cell body for the sensory is going to be the dorsal root ganglion line over here, and for the motors, it's going to be in the ventral horn located right there. So if we're looking at this, remember that the white matter is on the outside and the gray matter is on the inside when in the spinal cord. If you're thinking about what's going on in the cervical, let's just pretend we're talking about innervation of muscles. Let's look at three, let's think about axon tracts, white matter. So going through the cervical, I might have one axon that is ultimately going to supply the arms, one axon that's going to supply the abs, one axon that's going to supply the legs. When I get to the thoracic, now it's just one axon for the abs and one axon for the legs. And when we get to the lumbar, it's just one axon for the legs. So what do we see? We see that we're losing white matter as we go down, right? Because we don't need as many axon tracts. So there's very, very little axon tracts here because we just need them for the legs. Maybe a little bit more here, a little bit more here because it's the legs and the torso. And here we got a whole bunch because it's the legs, the torso, the arms. All the axon tracts have to go through the cervical layer. So you should be able to identify that just based on the white matter alone. Additionally, we're going to have this little lateral projection in the thoracic region for the lateral horn for the sympathetic nervous system. All right, so there's a lot going on here, and it's actually much more complicated than even this picture shows, but we just need to know about these. The corticospinal, dorsal column, and then the spinothalamic tract. So the corticospinal is going to be motor. Motor is descending. Dorsal column is dorsal column in the spinal cord, so that's what I'm going to call it for now. But remember that it's called the medial lemniscus when we get into the brainstem. And the names are kind of fitting here. Dorsal column is going to be dorsal in the spinal cord. It's going to be medial in the brainstem. So this is for proprioception, like knowing where your body is in space, and fine discriminatory touch, right? Like reading Braille or something like that, right? You can really, really fine tune and precisely tell one little bump from the other. And this is going to be ascending because it's sensory. This is also ascending. I don't know why it says descending because these two are sensory. And this one's going to be a little bit more primitive though. Crude touch, pain, temperature. How do we remember these? I always thought like cortico, like the brain. The brain is like initiating all of these complex like muscular movements. Like we talked about the basal ganglia, right? Like Robert Baratheon, the king. He is saying, I want to scratch my nose. I'm itchy, right? So we're planning the movements. So a lot of thought goes into the muscle movements, and that's the dumb way that I remember it, at least. Dorsal column, I think of like dorsal fin is a dolphin. What are dolphins? They're really smart, they're really evolved, really enhanced. So they have this sophisticated proprioception and fine discriminatory touch. Again, it's a little silly, it's how I remember it. And then the spinothalamic tract, I always thought of the spine. If you injure your spine, yeah, it's true, you can't move your muscles. But the first thing you always see in movies is someone gets in an injury in war and they don't go, oh no, I can't move my hand. They go, I can't feel my hand. I can't feel my leg. So that's at least how I remember that the spinothalamic has to do with like just sensory, just basic senses, like feeling something, pain, temperature. Yeah, fun. All right, so some decussations to know. Corticospinal is decussating at the medulla, at the lower medulla. Not all of them technically. So most of the motor tracts are going to go to the arms, legs, abs, things like that. But we do have some motor tracts that are going to the face, and the face is going to be above the medulla. So they technically they do decussate, right? Here's the right motor cortex. Everything is going to the left side of the body, but they're not decussating at the medulla. They're decussating, I don't know, somewhere else. I would know that all of the motor innervation is going to be the bulbar group when we are talking about like facial muscle innervation, bulbar. All right, so it's a two neuron tract for the corticospinal tract. So anything from the cortex down to the cell bodies in the ventral horn is going to be upper motor neuron, and anything from the ventral horn down to the muscle is going to be the lower motor neuron. And that's going to be really important for pathology later. And not everything is somatic, right? Like I'm flexing my bicep. Some of it's like visceral, like I need to do peristalsis and I need to, cause the smooth muscle to, contract or relax or something. The dorsal column is similar to corticospinal in that it also decussates at the lower medulla. There's also a difference between, there's two different tracts technically that make up the dorsal column. The nucleus cuneatus, which is for the arms, and the nucleus gracilis. I always thought, if you know about Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is all about like using your legs more than probably moving your arms. And so I think of gracilis, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, legs. Now is the spinothalamic, right? Spine, basic, can't feel my legs, baba, is pain, temperature. This is actually going to decussate at the right when it comes into the spinal cord through the dorsal aspect of the spinal cord. It's going to decussate and then ascend on the contralateral side. Actually, that's not always true. Sometimes it does do that, but there's actually something called the Sowers tract. So that, here's my spinothalamic nerve coming in. Instead of decussating right here, it actually might go up 1 or 2 levels. It can technically go down. It can descend 1 or 2 levels and then cross and then move upwards on the contralateral side. So this is going to be important when we get to things like Brown-Séquard syndrome and whatnot. So a little summary. Corticospinal tract, I think of cortico, brain, plan movements. This is decussating at the medulla. Don't worry about this. Worry about this. Knowing where these are. These are kind of on the posterior side, and this is kind of on the anterior side. This is going to be important for when we talk about strokes and whatnot. Looking at the dorsal column, you think of dorsal fin, dolphin, fine touch, proprioception. It's very smart, and this is also decussating like this at the medulla. And then we have the spinothalamic spine. I can't feel my spine. I can't feel my legs. Pain, temperature. This is very basic things. This is technically decussating at the vertebral level where it enters, or it can go through the Sowers tract and go up 1 or 2 and then decussate, which is going to be important. Also, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu is for the legs because you have the cuneatus for arms and the gracilis for the legs and the dorsal column.